Welcome to All Things Work. I'm your host, Ann Sparacco. Today, we're exploring how the new administration's recent DE&I executive orders and immigration policy shifts are impacting foreign-born workers in the workplace. So let's be straightforward. There is a lot going on here, and it can be overwhelming to keep up with it, which is why we're bringing in two special experts on this topic who can help us break this down and help us better understand how these policies will impact workplaces versus Justin Ladner, senior labor economist here at SHRM, and Julia Gelatt, associate director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. Welcome to All Things Work.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you guys. So let's begin with some introductions, starting with Julia. Julia, could you share a little bit about the work you've done in the legal immigration system and what you do now with the Migration Policy Institute?
Sure. At the Migration Policy Institute, we do quite a number of things from analyzing data to look at trends in immigration and the demographics of immigrants. We track the rapidly changing immigration policies that's more fast-paced than ever before. And we also develop proposals for immigration reform. Specifically on legal immigration, we have a new idea for improving our employment-based immigration system in the country. We call it the bridge visa. It's a temporary to permanent pathway, would expand employment-based opportunities for workers across the skill spectrum.
Such important work, especially right now as everybody's navigating this. So that's wonderful to hear. So turning to Justin, your work is part of the recently expanded economic research function here at SHRM, and your work centers around examining labor market trends and emerging issues facing employers and employees. So can you share a little bit more about your role for our audience?
Yeah, so I mean, you gave a pretty good description right there in terms of what we do. In the context of today's conversation, a big part of the work that we do is actually pretty basic. It's just describing populations and their role in the labor market, and that often I think reveals a lot of surprising things. There are lots of different groups that we care about. We talk about opportunity youth. We talk about older workers. We talk about all these different groups. Oftentimes the findings that we have reveal some really interesting information about how those roles have changed over time.
And you and your team really help us, stay up to date on the ever-evolving dynamics of the labor market. So we love your expertise, and we're excited for you both to be here. So Justin, you and your team recently produced a data brief titled "The Role of Foreign-Born People in the U.S. Labor Force." So can you walk us through a little overview of what this brief covers and how you advise organizations to leverage the data within it?
Yeah, so basically, this is a good example of a brief where our main goal was just describing this population of interest. Certainly, it's a very, very heightened interest recently, given all these policy changes. But basically, the goal of that brief, or any brief like this, is really just to provide an objective description of that population, its role in the labor force, and how that role has evolved over time. So the topics that we cover, we start off by basically saying this is how large the population is and how quickly it's grown over time. We talk about things like labor force participation rates, age distribution, representation in employment, both overall and by occupational group and by industry. We talk about geographic distribution of foreign-born people across the United States. And we talk about a few other topics. We talk about origin countries, both for kind of the overall foreign-born population and also for more recent migrants. And basically, we lay it out as a list of key findings that sort of build on each other and help the reader understand what this population looks like and what role it plays in the labor force.
Right. And I remember reading this report. There's a lot of great information in here. And we're going to get to some of those details and some data points in just a minute. But first, really wanted to jump into some information with Julia. You have some numbers on your organization's website. One that stood out to us was that there were 47.8 million immigrants living in the U.S. as of 2023, and nearly 3/4 were in the country legally. So question for you really is, what are the current policies guiding employers on hiring immigrants who are legally here in the U.S.? And what do the policies say about those undocumented immigrants?
The U.S. immigration system is big. We issue about 1.1 million green cards for permanent residents. each year. But most of those green cards are allocated on the basis of family. Our employment-based immigration system is pretty small for a country this big. There's 140,000 employment-based green cards available each year. So just a small share of the overall number. And about half of those go to family members. So there's really fewer than 70,000 employment-based permanent slots. There are also temporary work visas available. Many of those are for seasonal and temporary workers in agriculture or non-agricultural jobs. There are also high-skilled visas, but for college-educated workers. But for the many, many workers who are really important in our economy, who don't have a college diploma but want to work in a year-round job, there isn't any way for an employer to sponsor that kind of worker, like a home healthcare aide that we need for our aging population, or childcare workers, or I'm from Wisconsin, so people to work in the dairy industry, which is a year-round kind of job, but isn't a high-skilled job. So our immigration system has really specific slots and ways for people to come. It's really kind of inflexible. And then for unauthorized immigrants, it's illegal to hire someone who's not authorized to work in the United States. There are many millions of people here without status, but employers can't legally hire those workers.
Okay, so going back to the foreign-born workers report Justin worked on, Justin, can you tell us really what numbers stood out to you that really is the purpose behind this study?
So we start the brief out by making some really simple points about just the growth of this population over time and the nature of the population in terms of things like age distribution. So the very first figure is talking about the growth in the overall foreign-born population. That's 16 and older. It's grown. It's almost basically doubled in the 21st century to grow to nearly 50 million. As of October 2024, it stood at about 48.5 million. And similarly, the labor force participants, foreign-born labor force participants, that population has grown to be about 32.4 million as of October 2024. So very, very rapid growth, particularly since the kind of basically early 2021 on, we've seen a big influx of new migrants. And one big issue, I mean, in terms of talking about this, in terms of its role and its impact on the labor force, is that most foreign-born people coming into the United States are in their kind of prime working age years, so 25 to 54, or even a little bit younger. So they're going to age into their prime working age years. And the reason why that ends up being important is because the major motivation for migrating to the United States is to work. And as a result, we have most migrants end up being working age people, and they have higher labor force participation than their native-born counterparts. And again, a big reason for that is that the native-born population is aged over time, whereas the foreign-born population continuously is replenished by comparatively young people who are going to be more likely to work, which contributes to an increase in their role in the labor force over time.
Because we're seeing, this increase in labor force participation, a lot of people might be asking, okay, how do these recent executive orders and immigration policy shifts, will they affect this type of participation by the foreign-born workers? Can you guide us through that a little bit?
So it's difficult, I would say, to ascertain exactly what this will look like. One major issue is that there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how these policies will actually play out. Obviously, there are a lot of court cases surrounding many different policies, but some of them include immigration. So there's I think a debate about the extent to which deportations will actually happen, the extent to which new immigrants will be barred from entering the country. Certainly, I think the general concern is that these policy implementations will reduce the foreign-born population and prevent new migrants from entering the country, obviously legally.
Right.
And the net result of that is we'll have a stall or even a reversal in the growth of this population. And that ends up becoming very problematic from a labor supply point of view because the native-born population is going to continue to age, meaning that more and more people in that population are going to be moving out of the labor force. So one big benefit in terms of, because a lot of countries like the US have basically been going through very similar trends in population aging over time. Basically most European countries, Japan is an excellent example. And a byproduct of that is that their populations have actually been shrinking for the last couple of decades, sometimes pretty significantly. And their working age population in particular is getting smaller and smaller relative to the population at large. So for the US over the last several decades, a big kind of mitigating factor to population aging has been that we've had inflows of new migrants that are younger and keeping the population, keeping sort of helping labor supply growth continue. So one byproduct of these kind of restrictive policies is that it might lead to a decline or at least a slowing of the growth of labor supply, which ends up being a big challenge for employers and basically the labor market in general.
So, to Julia, in light of the White House's updated immigration policies, a lot of people are kind of looking for advice here in this realm because they're trying to navigate it as best they can. So, what advice do you have for business leaders who employ immigrants who are here legally as far as hiring, developing, and retaining these employees?
As Justin said, there's some uncertainty ahead around how the Trump administration policies will affect legal immigrants. I think one thing we can predict is that immigration is going to move even more slowly than it usually does. The Trump administration has talked about heavier vetting of immigrants. They've gotten rid of some in person visa interview waivers that used to be available. So people might face longer waits at consulates abroad to get visas. So planning ahead is really key here for businesses to think about their needs, to think about who needs to renew what visas and what that timeline might be. If they want to sponsor workers for green cards, doing that earlier than they might have before to leave more time for people to go through the process could be really important. And just having a lawyer on hand can be really helpful. We've seen some challenges of people with legal visas getting back into the United States at airports, having a plan in place if workers need to travel for how they can prepare and be ready and maybe have a lawyer on call could also be helpful.
Absolutely. And, similarly, but what about the employers who employ undocumented immigrants?
I mean, the first thing is that employers should not be employing people that they know to be in the country illegally or without work authorization. But right now, there are millions of people who don't have a firm legal status in the United States, but they
Right.
have some kind of temporary status that allows them to work legally. So there are hundreds of thousands of people with humanitarian parole, with temporary protected status, with DACA.
Mhm.
Um, and employers need to be ready that some of these legal statuses might be expiring under the Trump administration. We've seen some announcements about trying to end TPS grants, like for Venezuelans, that would affect hundreds of thousands of people. There's some questions about the people with humanitarian parole and if they'll be able to keep that status. So, keeping up to date on these changing policies, exploring what options might be available to retain current needed workers if they have any kind of immigration opportunities in the United States, supporting the workers and in getting those statuses could be helpful. And employers should have their ducks in a row in terms of, the I-9 process of checking that their employees are authorized, making sure that they have those records maintained somewhere, that if people presented them with an employment authorization document that has an expiration date, that they check after that date to see if the person is still authorized to work. So making sure that they're compliant could be really helpful in this environment.
Yeah, so key phrase, get your ducks in a row because that is super important as we prepare and try to navigate this. So thank you for that. That's good to keep in mind. That's why we're here talking about this. So going back to the report, Justin, according to the study, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, foreign-born workers account for more than 20% of employment in 7 different industries. Can you highlight some of those industries and really speak to why foreign-born representation is so strong in those types of sectors?
Yeah, so we do highlight that statistic. The overall representation of foreign-born people in employment is just under 20%. It's about 18.6%. At least that's an average in 2023. The 2024 values, which we have now, are actually a touch higher than that, more like 19%. The top industry is construction.
Mhm.
However, I think I would actually reference occupational groups as maybe being the more illuminative um,
Right.
group to look at because they really kind of reflect the types of skills and the types of jobs that foreign-born people are doing. So the top 3 groups for occupational groups in terms of foreign-born representation by far are construction and extraction, building, grounds cleaning and maintenance, and agriculture, forestry, and fishing. All those groups, their average foreign-born share of employment in 2023 was above 35%. For construction and extraction and building, grounds cleaning and maintenance, it was really very close to 40%. And that's a national average. If I look at certain, subparts of the United States, California, as an example, I think I remember looking at that statistic in 2024. It was something like 75% of agricultural workers in California are foreign-born people. So there are parts of the country where for a particular type of occupation, um, basically the foreign-born workforce is absolutely critical to those types of occupations being completed. And the thing that I think I would point out is that there's a lot of diversity in terms of the types of occupations that are doing. So those top three groups that I highlighted, they emphasize a lot of manual skills. However, foreign-born workers also have a high representation in computer and mathematical occupations. There's a lot of foreign-born workers who are coming into the U.S. and doing IT work or work that's related to that. So it's a very diverse set of skills, and there really isn't a single occupational group where the foreign-born workforce is, or foreign-born people are kind of a negligible component. So that's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind.
Yes, absolutely. Great information to keep in mind, especially the diversity aspect of their skills. So, Julia, whether an employer is in one of the sectors that Justin just mentioned or any other occupational group, in 2025, they are likely to face some potential disruption caused by the immigration enforcement. So, what are some concrete steps organizations can take to prepare for events like ICE raids or audits? And how can they best reassure and protect their foreign-born employees? Like we said, get your ducks in a row, but we're hoping to get a little bit, different context here.
Yeah, on top of making sure that the paperwork's in place, employers should have a plan of what they'll do if ICE does come to their door. ICE can go into public spaces um, freely, but they can't enter private spaces without either permission or a judicial warrant signed by a judge. And so employers should have a plan if immigration enforcement shows up, who's allowed to give them entry into the private spaces, sort of what's the plan? Does a front desk worker need to call their manager or call the owner? Do they have permission to make that decision? How would the company respond? And employers can talk to their employees about that. So everyone's aware of what the response will be. And everyone knows what their rights are under the law and is ready to exert those rights. Employers shouldn't be helping anybody break the law, but employers can take steps to minimize the disruption to their operations and to their company if any kind of law enforcement shows up at the door.
Thank you for answering that because I know that that's it's a big question, especially among HR workers. I know our HR Knowledge Center here at SHRM. They said they're advisors who take calls and questions from HR professionals and our SHRM members, and that was just one of the questions, that many of them that they were asking. So thank you for breaking that down for us. It's great to educate yourself and know what's legal here. So Justin, what key trends do you foresee with foreign-born workers over the next few years? Because now we're trying to look into the future a little bit, but we know that can't speculate too much.
Yeah, I would say, again, in terms of making projections, from a policy point of view and in terms of how we expect the foreign-born population to evolve, a huge challenge is just the level of uncertainty. There's the level of uncertainty in terms of to what degree immigrants will be able to enter the United States or remain in the United States. There's also economic uncertainty in a broader sense. So, for example, uncertainty regarding the sort of upcoming or the possibility of a recession that will very likely influence immigration flows. Because typically speaking, we see immigration decline in recessions because, again, people are generally coming to the United States for work opportunities. So when work opportunities decline in a recession, we tend to have fewer immigrants. The Great Recession in the 2007 to 2009 period was a good example of that. We had a real kind of slowdown and even slight reversal in the size of the foreign-born population. So there's all these different elements of uncertainty that make the next few years hard to predict. One thing that we can predict much more certainly, especially going out decades into the future, is that so the census, for example, produces these population projections that include a few different scenarios. They go from, and they're all scenarios based on immigration levels. So there's sort of a no immigration scenario, a low immigration scenario, kind of a main projection, which they think of that as being kind of the most likely scenario, and then a high immigration scenario. And one thing we didn't actually put that information in this particular brief, but we share this figure a lot. If I look at projections for the prime working age population, which we often focus on because it tends to be a really dominant part of the labor force, that population in its future growth really depends heavily on the level of immigration going forward. And again, this all relates to population aging and the fact that the native-born population in the United States has aged really rapidly and is expected to continue aging into the future. So in the no immigration scenario, our prime working age population is actually going to be falling pretty much immediately. And I mean, obviously that scenario is not necessarily likely, but it kind of highlights the issue. I mean, one major sort of historical variable that's correlated with economic growth and prosperity is labor supply growth. And one challenge that we face is growing the labor supply in the context of population aging. It's not a US specific challenge. I mentioned before that there are countries around the world that are facing this challenge, often in more extreme cases. Immigration is not the only lever to resolve that or to solve that problem, but it has historically been one of the most accessible levers in the United States and in other countries.
Right, right. And so looking at, the data that, that you were just talking about and the data that SHRM already has, whether it's a policy or industry or skill gap related, what type of advice do you have for employers to kind of stay ahead of these trends or potential trends?
The advice that I would have, I mean, I think Julia's already outlined it very well. Basically having, basically understanding what the law is and what the policies are, obviously adhering to the law, and looking for as many opportunities as you can in an already competitive labor market, to attract as much talent as you can. So, for example, if the expectation, if you know as an employer that you already rely on foreign-born workers a lot in the present day, I think a reasonable expectation going forward is that there's going to be is that employer would have some labor supply challenges. So the broadly speaking solutions for them are, again, making sure they can legally retain the workers that they have, and also trying to find potentially new sources of talent, if the flow of new immigrants becomes curtailed in any way.
Look into those untapped talent pools. Thanks, Justin. And Julia, looking ahead again for your question, really to wrap things up, is what role do you see employers playing in shaping future immigration reforms that align with both workforce and societal needs? We know it's a balance here.
I think employers can have a really big voice in conversations around immigration policy with the White House, with Congress. And DC, I think, really needs to hear from local employers. There's a really big disconnect between the conversations that are happening now, where all immigrants are cast as criminals, or are cast as taking, jobs from U.S. workers. We've talked today about all of the demographic forces that mean that the country is really going to rely on immigrants for continuing growth of our labor market and our economy. And employers on the ground see that every day. But I think sometimes people in DC get caught up in sort of bigger political pictures, rather than these on the ground realities. I know employers have a lot of issues that they're thinking about right now. There's tariffs, there's tax policy. Maybe they need to pick their battles. But I hope that, as they come together in local chambers of commerce and other groups, maybe immigration can be somewhere on the agenda to make sure that they, as our economy continues to grow, that they have access to the workforce that they need.
And of course, a lot of the data that Justin brought up really supports what you've been saying throughout this episode of All Things Work. So I would love to leave our audience with some final thoughts from you both that we may not have included in this episode so far. So Justin, is there anything else that really stood out from the report that you feel you would love to share?
So that's a great question, Ann. One kind of common theme in the report, and I've already touched on it a little bit here, is that the foreign-born population is diverse in so many ways that I think a lot of people don't understand. So I mentioned before that they have a much more diverse set of skill sets than I think people would imagine. Another topic that I think is interesting, or another point that's interesting, is if I look, this was using American Community Survey data. If we look at that data and we look at recent migrants year by year from about the early 2000s, like 2006 on, I think 2006, 2023 is what we covered in the report. We actually find that the origin countries of recent migrants, first off, they mostly come from Latin America and Asia. About 70 to 80% in any given year come from those two regions of the world. But the fraction that come from those different regions actually varies a little bit over time. So for several years in the 2010s, actually a significant plurality of migrants came from Asian countries, particularly places like China, India, the Philippines. Those always rank very highly. Now, more recently, in the last couple of years, Latin America has accounted for a larger share. But really, with only two exceptions, I want to say the 2 years, there are exceptions of 2006 and 2023, no absolute majority of migrants have come from either from Latin America. The last year, 2023, about half, 51% of new migrants, of recent migrants came from Latin America, with the remaining half mostly coming from about evenly split between Asia and the rest of the world. So that would be, I guess, one additional point of just the kind of describing the diversity of this population.
Thank you, Justin. And jumping off of what Justin just said, Julia, do you have anything else that you would love to include in this episode?
Yeah, as we talk about the role of immigrants in the US workforce and sort of looking to the future, I think it's important to think both about pathways for new immigrants to come in. We know that's important given our demographics, but also ways to harness the talents of immigrants who are already here. There are lots of foreign trained professionals in the United States that are struggling to be able to use those credentials and work in their careers that they used to work in countries abroad, making more efforts and having employers work harder and work with nonprofit organizations to help those workers retrain and regain their credentials so they can fill those roles again and really contribute to their fullest extent could boost our economic growth and help some of our companies. There are also millions of people in the country who don't have legal status or who have some kind of legal status that might be temporary and about to expire. I think thinking as a country, thinking with Congress about ways to create pathways for those workers to stay and work legally in the United States could also help us harness the talents and contributions and tax payments of those folks and help grow our economy as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for your insight. You really helped us guide us through this, complicated topic. And we know a lot of employers have a lot to go through and navigate this year. So thank you for your guidance and your wonderful insight.
Thank you, Anne.
All right, that's going to do it for this week's episode of All Things Work. For more information, just head to shrm.org/allthingswork to learn more and to sign up for our newsletter. You can also head to social media to like, comment, or share. We want to hear your thoughts and questions. That'll be it for this week. We'll catch you next time.
SHRM.